So good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here in the School of Medicine at UVA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. This is a program entitled The Continuing Relevance of America's Eugenic Legacy. The history of eugenics is often characterized as a cautionary tale about the bad old days when pseudoscientific assumptions about genetic determinism and engineering human improvement permeated science, medicine, and social attitudes, and provided a respectable veneer that enabled barely submerged racism, xenophobia, and blatant discrimination against persons with disabilities to take root in American law. Some argue that more recently, our science is sound, our attitudes enlightened. We need not be hobbled by fear of debunked bad eugenic habits. Paul Lombardo, the Regents Professor and Bobby Lee Cook Professor of Law at Georgia State University in Atlanta, has written extensively on eugenics and the law in America. As one of the undisputed experts on this subject, he continues to track our nation's eugenic legacy as this evolves in the early 21st century. He joins us here to look again at eugenics assumptions and ask some questions critical for us today. What is eugenics' legacy in our country now? Are the same underlying tendencies that led to a century of eugenic law and policy to be found in our public debate about democratic values and social policies? And what is the proper role of science and medicine as tools for solving social problems? Professor Lombardo's presentation is one of our History of the Health Sciences lectures, produced in partnership with Historical Collections in the Claude Moore Health Sciences Library. His talk is also the second annual Joan Echtenkamp Klein Memorial Lecture in the History of the Health Sciences. This lecture is named for our longtime dear colleague and inimitable friend who, as Alvin B. and Nancy Baird curator, was the heart and soul of historical collections for the period from 1982 until her untimely death in December of 2015. As one who understood that history is always a crucial component, sometimes even a driver of the present moment, Joan was a co-conspirator with many of us on some great projects over a great many years. She was also a generous friend of and contributor to the Medical Center Hour. We miss her and are honored to honor her memory with this lecture. It's fitting that Paul Lombardo is presenting this year's lecture, for it was Joan who decades ago worked closely with him when he was another of our colleagues here at UVA, and he was just starting his research into eugenics in America, and indeed into eugenics' place, power, and practical impact in local Charlottesville and University of Virginia history. I'll also say before welcoming him that Professor Lombardo has no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. So please welcome Paul Lombardo, who spent many years here at UVA before he headed south to Georgia. Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. I think maybe one of these days when I grow up, I'm going to have a conflict of interest that I can disclose. But since the kids are graduating from college, it's probably too late. I want to thank Marcia and Dan for the invitation, particularly for the honor of speaking here at the Joan Echtenkamp Klein Memorial Lecture. As Marcia said, Joan was a friend of mine and a colleague for more than 35 years. And in the time that she was here, she figured very significantly in my own research on the history of eugenics. And so as I prepared for this talk, I was repeatedly reminded of how often I relied on Joan, how often she directed me to material that I used in my own scholarships, how regularly she invited me to be involved in meetings and symposia, and some of you will remember many, many parties which she put together. And those were places where I met other archivists, other librarians, and other scholars. And so it's only fitting that I note some of those occasions as part of my remarks today, with apologies for too many personal references, but because the material that I discovered with Joan's help became inextricably intertwined with the historical explorations in eugenics that I'm going to talk about today. So I will talk later a bit more about Joan and some of those things, but I want to take everybody to the same, at least, starting line, and that is this word eugenics. You have to start in the same place. You've got Gregor Mendel, who tells us what the rules of heredity are with his pea plants, and his ideas happen and come back about the same time that Francis Galton comes up with this new word, meaning well-born. And so you really have to start with Galton and Mendel. I think of the biostatistics of Galton as married to the heredity of Mendel as really being the foundation for what happens in America under the label of eugenics. Within a generation, people were looking at Galton, looking at his ideas, and proposing ways to make eugenic ideas a practical reality. Here, the clergy discussed the issuance of marriage certificates that would be proof that couples were fit to marry and had been so declared by medical experts. Before long, the idea becomes more widespread. And every newspaper is full of articles about eugenics. There were organizations initiated to promote the so-called eugenic ideal of good birth, and describing your tot as a eugenic baby was all the rage. In this particular case, contest winners were betrothed in their early years by their parents, who said, what better could we do? A couple gold prize winners will get them together in eugenics' name. Even the federal government gets in on the act in the person of the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service, who issues the first, perhaps the only, official eugenic marriage certificate to this man, Homer Terrell, an employee of, at that time, the Treasury Department. Families who pursued the eugenic ideal, meaning healthy, happy babies, were celebrated in their communities in these fitter family contests, which I suspect you may have heard of. The media coverage of those fairs looked something like this. Science applies to human stock the same principles which have developed champion cows and horses and prize hens to lay the foundation for proposed laws to regulate the rules for human mating. It is difficult, it is very difficult to exaggerate how pervasive the word eugenics was early in the 20th century and the extraordinary numbers of meanings it took on, having to do with health and hygiene and prosperity. How eugenics was used in advertising gives us just one clue about the popularity of the concept. And I have a whole show on this, but I'll just share a few of these with you. For example, there were eugenic cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, from lemon shampoo to hair tonic. There was, of course, eugenic corn. There were even eugenic diamonds, which, just like eugenic marriages, required a certificate of fitness. It was not surprising that with sentiments like these, the American Magazine of Wit and Satire would say on its cover in 1913, eugenics makes the world go round. So this is the image of health, which is linked with the eugenic ideal and highlighted as a promise to future generations, and the impulse for social improvement, the wish to eradicate suffering and the life problems that plague society was a large part of what attracted people, many, if not most Americans, to eugenics. But that ideal, of course, had other implications, which I like to describe as made up of equal parts hope and hate, equal parts aspiration and fear. The side that represented people's fears often included a very heavy-handed kind of biological determinism that played out in propaganda like this. And I'm going to spend my time talking to a large extent about this side, showing us that unfit human traits can all be breeded out, it says. What your environment is what you have, your education is what you do, but what you really are, that's your heritage. And if you didn't have good parents, too bad, you're too late. So I'm going to look at the legal result of this propaganda, but I do want to stop for just a second to remember our friend Joan, the person this lecture is named for, and how important she was both to my own scholarship, but also how she made it certain that Virginia would not forget its own history in this field. Joan and I came to UVA at about the same time in the late 70s, and we met in 1980 in the basement of Alderman Library while I was dealing with learning how to breathe in dust in an archive Joan already knew. I was in the process of writing on the topic that would become my dissertation on Virginia's eugenic history in the case of Buck versus Bell. I got to know Joan a bit better when she took over the special collections at the medical school, and I went on to law school and conferred with her a couple times, and she was extraordinarily helpful in the first two law review articles that I wrote. One was on Buck, the other was on Loving versus Virginia, and it is an interesting coincidence that we are now celebrating anniversaries of both those Supreme Court cases in eugenics this year. Buck, 90 years, and Loving versus Virginia, 50 years, and there's even an Academy Award nominated film on that out there. So a lot happened here in eugenics. I went off to practice law, but when I came back here in 1990, Joan and I picked up where we left off, and I often found myself in the medical school library where she usually shared her most recent acquisitions. And in 1993, she asked me if I would agree to participate in a symposium on the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. Well, I said yes, and because of Joan, I got to join scholars like Jim Jones, and Vanessa Norton Gamble, John Fletcher, and others in discussing Tuskegee. And I got to watch over the next several years as the momentum grew toward a presidential repudiation of the study. And that finally did occur in 1997, and Joan is shown here meeting President Clinton as the movement culminates in a presidential apology. My time at Joan's symposium led me in a different direction. It provided me a motive to look back into the part of the Tuskegee history that had not been explored. I was surprised to discover that the three architects shown here, Hugh Cumming, Raymond Vondelier, and Taliaferro Clark, had all been UVA medical graduates. And with Joan's help, I eventually marshaled the evidence for this article, which I did with my then student Gregory Dorr, which attributed some of the results of Tuskegee, and certainly a lot of its longevity, to the training that these men had in racial medicine, in public health, and in eugenics here at UVA. The spring after that symposium, Joan asked me to give a lecture in the history of health sciences on eugenics, and so I did, following a screening of the Lynchburg Story, a film that documented eugenical sterilization here in Virginia. And Joan later invited me to present at a meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archivists Conference, a group that I knew nothing of at the time. But there I met an archivist who suggested a couple databases and said maybe you should look at those for source materials. And as a result, when I turned home, just learning how to use the internet, I was able to find a batch of records that included this picture of Carrie Buck and her mother Emma, taken before the trial in 1924. I'd been looking for a photo of Carrie Buck for 20 years by then, so this was a big day for me. And when I showed it to Joan, she immediately said, "Oh, you've got to do a paper for the history meeting." "What history meeting?" I said. She said, "The American Association for the History of Medicine." And so I did, and I presented a paper in this picture, and began an involvement which has lasted ever since then. In early 2002, Joan asked me to showcase the Buck story again in her lecture series, and she used that occasion to kick off an exhibit on eugenics that was displayed in the medical library for a number of months and subsequently became a web exhibit which you can still find online. Later in the semester, on the 75th anniversary of the Buck case, Joan came to join me over on Preston Avenue at an event that marked the dedication of the Buck marker I put up, which is now permanently located there in front of Region 10. And Governor Warner used that occasion to make Virginia the first state to apologize to the victims of sterilizations. So it should be obvious that Joan was a key player in focusing attention on the history of eugenics, and I personally have a great deal to thank her for. But she also showcased the historical work of others. UVA grad Gregory Dorr from the history department here also presented at the History of Health Sciences lecture on Virginia eugenics, and his dissertation, later this book, highlighted a number of prominent UVA grads and members of the faculty who were active in the 20th century movement. Prominent among them, Harvey Jordan, the person for whom this building was originally named. And you might ask, as students usually do, well, how did he get here? And the answer is relatively straightforward. Dr. Alderman, the first president of UVA, following the German model that had been transplanted to Johns Hopkins, took it upon himself to raise UVA into the rank of elite universities. And he started by looking for young scholars. He started by looking for people who were doing research and who were publishing and who had a national profile. And he hired Dr. Harvey Ernest Jordan because he was exactly one of those people. He came here in 1907, directly from summer study at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, the home of the Eugenics Record Office. Jordan was internationally known. He gave papers at conferences such as the First International Congress of Eugenics, and his articles were published in those proceedings. He was also very interested in embedding eugenics in the medical curriculum, as Greg Dorr has documented, and he was very successful. He was particularly interested in studying STDs as a dysgenic influence. More on that later. And he took his place among the most prominent scholars of eugenics in the country. He was around like-minded people. Another important member of the faculty at one time was John Powell, composer, pianist, really important musician in the 1920s. But another part of his contribution to American life had little to do with music, and that was the foundation of this group, the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America, who sponsored and advocated the 1924 Racial Integrity Act that prohibited marriage between whites and all other races. A bit more on that later, too. One of the first chapters of that organization was here at UVA. And this document, which is its constitution, called for the maintenance of Anglo-Saxon institutions and ideals, the wise limitation of immigration, and the complete exclusion of unassimilable immigrants, the principles of honor and fair play in all relations of life, and the supremacy of the white race in the United States of America. Powell wrote other things, such as this tract, which amplified fears of intermarriage when Virginia's a Native American population interbred with people who had been from families formerly enslaved. Powell wrote art editorials, one called Is America to Become a Negroid Nation, which he published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And he said, it is not enough to segregate the Negro on railway cars and streetcars and schools and theaters. It is not enough to restrict his exercise of the franchise, as long as the possibility remains of the absorption of Negro blood into our white population. And he went on to say that it was the development of eugenical science that paved the way for this new law that would be passed. Powell was praised for his work in passing that act, and others described him for his distinct and distinguished service to the Anglo-Saxon race that would, they said, ensure him a place in history. Powell was here at the same time as Jordan, as was Dr. Robert Bennett Bean. Bean took his time learning and becoming known as a racially focused physical anthropologist. He too thought that this is what ought to be taught in every medical school, and he wrote an article to that effect that was published in Science magazine in 1921. He too was concerned about interracial marriage and the degradation of the white race, and he continued to pay attention to what was known as race suicide in his most famous book, The Races of Man, Differentiation and Dispersal, which was published while he was here on the faculty. In it, he emphasized specific distinguishing characteristics of different racial groups. He thought whites had large brains, were active, physically vivacious, had strong ambitions and passions and idealism. He also thought that their industry was incessant and elaborate. In contrast, he described blacks as people who had a strong and somewhat irrational egoism, but whose worst diseases came from sexual promiscuity and contact with the white race. Dr. Bean is generally known as one of the fathers of scientific racism in America. Another faculty member whose time overlapped with all the people I've mentioned was, of course, biologist Ivy Foreman Lewis, who later became dean of the college. He came to UVA in 1915, and in his nearly 40 years here, he left a record as a staunch hereditarian, a convinced eugenicist, and a proponent of white racial purity. This is what Greg Dorr has to say in his book, Segregation Science, about Dr. Lewis. In his professional swan song, performed in 1951 on a national stage at the annual convention of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Lewis incited a tremendous controversy. His talk, called Biological Principles and National Policy, hammered eugenical themes, outraged listeners, and caused the AAAS to break precedent and refuse to publish his speech in its flagship journal, Science. Lewis had argued that those who contribute least to the general welfare have the largest families, and selection of the worst rather than the best as parents of the next generations flies in the face of biological laws. Now, that's not a pretty picture, and the things that I have pointed out to you, you might say were unusual, unique, and particularly bothersome. But I have to remind you that having spent this time talking about UVA faculty members who were entrenched in the eugenics movement, and having reminded you that Joan Klein was a key person in making sure that that history was available for this community, I do not want to leave you with the false impression that UVA was somehow an anomaly in its engagement on this topic. What I have presented only scratches the surface of how common such scholars were in colleges and universities at the time. A survey of colleges in 1920 showed more than 300 who taught eugenics as part of the curriculum. I'm convinced if you did a survey today and went back to the records, that number would probably double. We just didn't have surveys that were as good back then. It is certainly true that Virginia and this university provided national leadership in the ranks of eugenics, but what happened here also happened around the country at many elite universities, and here are just a few examples. There's Charles W. Eliot, the famous president of Harvard University, known for his, 5-foot bookshelf of wisdom. He was one of the strongest proponents of the Immigration Restriction Act. Irving Fisher, first PhD in political science at Yale, a strong proponent not only of immigration restriction but also of sterilization, a member of the Scientific Board of Directors of the Eugenics Record Office. David Starr Jordan was one of the founders of the very first eugenic professional organization in America around 1905. He was the first president of Stanford University. Victor Vaughn, a giant in public health, dean of the University of Michigan Medical School, also strong in this field. And at the bottom, Edward Thorndike, the psychologist who did so much to make sure that mental measurement testing became part of the American educational landscape. And then finally, William Welch, the godfather of medical education, the president of the American Public Health Association, Mr. Who's Who on every letterhead of every organization you can imagine. He too was on the first scientific board of directors for the Eugenics Record Office. So the point is, all of these men provided a public face for the eugenics movement on American campuses from about 1905 until at least World War II. And all of these universities, just like UVA, were proud of the courses, the research, and the publications in eugenics that their faculty produced. This set of ideas, complex set of ideas, was part of the mainstream of medicine and science for a very significant time during the 20th century. And in the broader population, these ideas, both the hopeful ones, the aspirational ones, as well as the hateful ones and the fearful ones, captured the attention of an enormous group of prominent, noteworthy people who at one time or another, in different forms and for widely divergent reasons, embraced the ideas that were part of the so-called eugenic ideal. Now you might ask, so what? Why should we care? Well, as a historian and as a lawyer, I care because the ideas that we associate with eugenics were imprinted on hundreds of American laws that lasted in some cases for an entire century. Here's a list of just 5 categories: laws passed in the name of eugenics. And I'm going to walk through each one of those. The first ones, starting with Connecticut in 1895, were passed to prevent marriages by people who were disabled. Connecticut law specifically prohibited marriage by anyone who was diagnosed with epilepsy. And one of the first proposals of the official eugenics committee would have extended those laws to prohibit the blind from marrying. This proposal came from W.M. Hayes, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture under Teddy Roosevelt, and a member of the American Breeders Association. Others wanted to battle the spread of STDs. Ministers advocated for eugenic screenings before marriage as early as 1905. One reason for the clergy's support was that there was a long and rich mythology about sexual misbehavior and heredity, and every manner of disability, from this man's premature decline caused by syphilis to his son's blindness and his daughter's withered limb, were bundled together as if all of a piece. Results of immoral living, evidence of an intergenerational curse that cascaded through families from parents to children as part of an hereditary legacy. Even baseball player turned evangelist Billy Sunday pushed eugenic themes in one of his most famous sermons, playing to packed crowds, hammering away at the dangers of sexual excess. The sermon was called "The Chickens Come Home to Roost," and it invoked the famous Jukes family, that legendary problem family of criminals and ne'er-do-wells marked by immorality and feeble-mindedness. And of the two people who started that family, he bemoaned the power of one God-forsaken, vicious, corrupt man and woman to breed and propagate and damn the whole world by their offspring. The public health implications of STDs were also obvious. The relationship between having healthy babies, remember eugenics means well-born, and the dangers of so-called venereal diseases led many to attempt to educate people about the careful choice of marriage mates. The graphic in this publication, Take Off the Hoodwink, Don't Go Blindly into Marriage, illustrates a pamphlet in 1924 urging couples to be more aware of the health, including the eugenic health of prospective spouses. Beginning in about 1910, most of the states in the country passed public health laws to prevent marriage between people with STDs, and those laws were uniformly known as the eugenic marriage laws. Among the first states, and the one was the most controversial, was Wisconsin. That law was eventually tested in court, and as you can see from this headline, the court found in 1914 that the eugenic law was valid. It, of course, was legislation that would guard innocent women and their even more innocent babies. Another kind of marriage restriction law emphasized means of preventing the purportedly harmful mixture between races. These laws, called the anti-miscegenation laws, were in place in more than 20 states, and many of them relied on the arguments of this man, Madison Grant, known as the father of racial anthropology, who in 1916 published his famous and wildly successful book, The Passing of the Great Race, or the Racial Basis of European History. Grant gave the eugenics movement a new set of arguments to support existing restrictions on marriage, and he warned that racial mixing was one avenue down the slope towards so-called racial suicide and the eventual disappearance of white civilization. In his book, he provided a formula which we still refer to today to determine who should be able to claim a white heritage. The cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro. The children of mixed marriages between contrasted races belong to the lower type. That is the formula which became known as Grantism, and it's the formula that is built into Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which was passed as a public health measure, shown here on the cover of the Virginia Health Bulletin that year. And it was thought to present the spread of what were thought to be deficiencies that would pollute the white race via contact with other inferior races. So this is a very clear example of the racial side of eugenics law. Grant's thinking was also critical in another piece of eugenic legislation, the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, variously known as the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Quotas Act. Politicians like Calvin Coolidge had read Grant, and this is what he said: biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. Nordics propagate themselves successfully. With other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. Quality of mind and body suggests that observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity to a nation as immigration law. And so, beginning in the 1880s, American laws became more and more harsh, with various tests meant to sort out the useful immigrants from those who were thought not fit for American life. Here, recently landed immigrants or travelers are lined up in the Great Hall of Ellis Island for processing, literally being marked with a piece of chalk so they can be screened for insanity and other defects. Eventually, they move on to be tested for physical problems such as trachoma of the eye, and then they're given IQ tests to screen out the mentally suspect. The man shown in this picture is a member of the Public Health Service Corps. His name is Howard Knox, and he wrote about his experience giving IQ tests in articles like this: How the Public Health Service Prevents Contamination of Our Racial Stock by Turning Back Feeble-Minded Immigrants. So you can see that this is part not only of public sentiment, but certainly public policy and law. This law is a model, it turns out, for others. This particular quotation is taken from some of the comments made in his book Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote while he was languishing in prison. And he says then, at present there exists one state which manifests at least some modest attempts to show a better appreciation of how things ought to be done. It is not our model German Republic, it's the US of A. which is making efforts to conform at least partly to the counsels of common sense by refusing immigrants to enter there if they are in a bad state of health, by excluding certain races from the right to become naturalized. They have begun to introduce principles similar to those on which we wish to ground the people's state. That he said, of course, before he came to power. Support for immigration restriction, for sterilization, for marriage restriction, for all kinds of racially based restrictions and quotas were meant to address the demise of the majority Anglo-Saxons, whose decrease would mark, as Madison Grant said, the passing of the great race. And this widespread anxiety over what was popularly known as race suicide was on display, especially between the two world wars. The last law I want to talk about is the one I've probably spent the most time on, and that's the eugenic sterilization laws. And to introduce that topic, I have taken a paragraph from Scientific American in February of 1875. The date is important because it shows that even before the word eugenics exists, there is a movement to apply principles that the eugenicists would glom onto. This is an article called The Knife Remedy. We can only regard it as an illustration of the power of popular prejudice that people are ready to hold up their hands in horror at the most guarded suggestion of the advisability of making it impossible for lusty savages to inflict upon the community a brood of ill-balanced organisms destined to swell the ranks of vice and crime. Yet society may be driven to adopt just such radical measures in self-defense. So the knife remedy, as they call it, is recommended even in a scientific publication before the formal ideas of eugenics take place. So the point is, policies that are made into law don't really require us to use that word. But eugenics does give those who would argue for sterilization an entire ideology on which to found public policy. Now, in 30-odd years of talking about these cases, I think I can distill what I know into a short statement. The arguments in favor of eugenics were about two things. They were about sex, almost always, and they were about money, always. Let me show you what I mean by that. The state of Alabama went to pass one of the last sterilization laws in the 1930s, and they proposed a bill, and I'll read you what that bill says. This was a bill in 1935 to sterilize any sexual pervert, sadist, homosexualist, masochist, sodomist, or any other grave form of sexual perversion, or any prisoner who has twice been convicted of rape or thrice imprisoned for any offense, or any mental deficient of any grade who habitually and constantly is dependent upon public relief or supported by charity. If you look at all the sterilization laws that were passed between 1907 in Indiana and 1937 in Georgia, you will find that they all include, from different eras and different places, the categories enumerated in the bill that I just quoted from. They all focus on what was at the time considered unconventional sexuality, disability of various types, either in the way they were described at the time or in the very language they use. They include attention to the social costs generated by people who embody those behaviors. So it is always, to me, at some level, about sex and money, and it's often also about people living on the margins of society because of their race or their ethnicity or their disability. People who violated social norms in the realm of sexuality were defined as deviant and or criminals. They filled the jails, the poorhouses, the asylums, and other institutions that were paid for with tax dollars. Wiping out that behavior or the possibility of children who would inherit such behavioral propensities and those costs were a big part of the motive force behind eugenical sterilization laws. And so the first one is passed in 1907 with the help of Dr. Harry Sharp here, the physician at the Indiana Reformatory, whose great concern was masturbation in the prison. Sterilize those people, we won't have any more prisoners, they have this propensity, we can cut it out of them. And so his law was entitled An Act to Prevent Procreation of Confirmed Criminals, Idiots, Imbeciles, and Rapists. And the preamble said heredity plays a most important part in the transmission of crime, idiocy, and imbecility. That idea was taken forward by other people. Most noteworthy was the model law that was written by this man, Harry Laughlin, in 1914, 7 years later after the Indiana law. And in his model sterilization law, Laughlin said, we've got to get rid of the socially inadequate classes. The socially inadequate people were those like the feeble-minded, the insane, the criminalistic, the inebriate, the epileptic, the diseased, the blind, the deaf, the deformed, the dependent, orphans, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, the homeless, and paupers. Laughlin covered the waterfront. Laughlin got a chance to speak to this issue legally when he appeared as a witness by deposition in the famous case of Buck versus Bell. Here's Carrie Buck, the picture I showed you earlier. On the left, her mother, Emma, on the right. Carrie was 17 at the time when she was committed to the Virginia colony for the epileptics and the feeble-minded. She met her mother, who had been declared a moral degenerate because she was suspected of being a prostitute. Her mother had been declared feeble-minded and unable to take care of herself. Carrie was also called feeble-minded because only 3 months before her arrival, she had a baby. And the problem was she wasn't married. So she, too, was called a moral degenerate. The baby, shown here in a companion picture taken the same day, was examined by doctors and other experts and called not normal and not quite right, which made the Buck family the perfect example of what Virginia's brand new 1924 Sterilization Act had been meant to address. Problem families suffering from mental and moral defects, intergenerational poverty, criminality, sexual excess, and probably most importantly, a tendency to consume more than their small share of tax-supported services. That was what the eugenics law was about. It was meant over time to eliminate all those conditions as well as the people who carried them. So Carrie was the person picked to test the law. The person who wrote the law was this man, Aubrey Strode, who drafted the statute and then later defended it all the way through the Supreme Court. Strode, of course, is the person who was a graduate, was a student here at UVA and also a law student, and it's his papers over in Alderman Library that first got me interested in this whole matter. In the case that Strode brought against Carrie Buck, he said that these things, poverty, disease, inappropriate sexuality, could be wiped out by surgery, and he showed the Buck family history. It's been captured after the fact in this slide. He showed this in court. He said, we have hereditary moral degeneracy, illicit sex, mental defect that reverberates through 3 generations of the Buck family. The case was decided several years later in 1927, and the opinion was written infamously by then Senior Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said it is better for all the world, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. And in one of the great non sequiturs of Supreme Court opinions, he then reached for a precedent and found one in the smallpox vaccination case of several years earlier, and said the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. He described the Buck family again with their 3 generations of defect and said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Now, Carrie Buck, for herself, went on to live another 63 years, and all her life she was poor, and when she died, she and her family that survived still carried the shame of the Holmes opinion. Here she is a few weeks before she died. When I met her in 1983, she confirmed to me that she was pregnant in 1923, not because of her moral failings, but because she had been raped. She died in this hospital. Her daughter Vivian left her own records, such as this 2nd grade honor roll record over from the Venable School, showing that she was not feeble-minded after all. And there were other records. Probably the most distressing, if you're a lawyer, are the ones from Irving Whitehead, the man who was appointed and paid very well to represent Carrie Buck, but in fact betrayed his client and defrauded the court, leaving the record as a fraud and a sham. We also didn't learn 2 years later that Harry Laughlin, the man who wrote the model law and then testified against Carrie Buck, had received an honorary degree from the Nazis in 1936 for his work in what they called the science of racial cleansing. So we're left with the Buck case, the shame of the states, 8,300 or so sterilized in Virginia, some 60, 65,000, who knows how many sterilized nationally under eugenic sterilization laws. And by the time the last state had passed a law, the practice had, of course, spilled over into Europe. Another 14 places passed laws. But, of course, the Nazi law was the most Important one because it was used to sterilize some 400,000 to 500,000 people. And we also know that the Nazis practiced eugenic euthanasia of those with mental impairments and redefined eugenic exclusion to include genocide. So, if we look back at the sterilization laws, we can see how they covered all the problematic groups, the sexually deviant criminals, the feeble-mindedness, the people with feeble-mindedness who were blamed for every manner of social ill, and the costs of the juvenile court or the infirmary and the workhouse and the police, and of course the very expensive institutionalized mentally ill. These are headlines from New York, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Arizona, and the story is pretty much the same wherever you go. Taking care of disabled people is expensive. The economic motive is never far from the surface. Better breeding through tax cuts was a common eugenic mantra. So where are we today? Well, we have lots of new technologies, and they are exciting technologies, and they are technologies that those of us who have the privilege of working in universities get to argue about and get to question on all kinds of grounds, ethical, political, and otherwise. But I put those off to the side for a moment because as important as they are, and as important as it is for us to argue about them, they're not what I'm worried about. When people ask me what eugenics is still here and what I should worry about, I'm not worried about cloning so much. I'm really not worried about the sensational and sometimes irresponsible speculations that fill the popular press about the potentially genetic basis for crime or even the potential for somebody's idea of super babies and a hypothetically created master race. As I said, it's important to debate the ethical impact of all those technologies. But what concerns me that we spend so much time arguing over or not whether we should call those things eugenics. My concerns about eugenics in the future is not about new technologies. It's about old attitudes, very old attitudes, some very old-fashioned bigotry that is still focused on the least powerful people in our society and the attempts to blame them for all of our problems. If we focus on those attitudes, we would realize that they were the most important foundation for the practices that we condemn as the worst result of eugenic thinking now. So again, if you ask me what is the contemporary relevance of eugenics, this is my answer. We have seen too often lately, we have seen public displays of unabashed contempt for the disabled. We have seen a chorus of hate focused on people who violate conventional sexual norms. We hear daily about the need to eradicate social welfare programs that are aimed at addressing crime or poverty or disease. And the nation's attention is now focused on an unvarnished campaign to ramp up the rhetoric of decay and fear and hate to justify closing the borders against people whose presence would threaten the white demographic balance. We also hear the old mantra, all of this has to be done to make us safe in future generations and to lower our taxes today. Race suicide hangs in the balance. So because all these strains of thought remain a part of our current political landscape, I still think that eugenics continues to be worth our attention as a field of historical study. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
Thank you, Paul. That was quite a trip through the late 19th and 20th centuries. And for our audience now, there's plenty of time for us to entertain your questions and comments. When I bring you the mic, please identify yourself.
My name is Michael Swanberg. I'm from the School of Nursing. And first, I'd like to thank you for acknowledging Joan Klein. She was so important to so many of us in our work. And through Joan Klein, I first became familiar with Gregory Michael Dorr's work. And you talked about attitude. What was the attitude of the university to Gregory Dorr's work?
That's a hard question because I'm not sure I know the answer. He was a PhD graduate. His work, while he was still a student, won national prizes. I know his teachers were proud of that. I know the people on his dissertation committee, along with me, were proud of what he did. I think that these are topics that are always discomforting in an institutional sense because they're not fun. They're just not fun things to talk about. I mean, I go and talk places and they say, well, we've got so-and-so who's going to talk about the wonderful new technology, and we've got so-and-so who's going to talk about other issues, and then Lombardo's the downer. And I understand what they say. These are not happy stories. But as I think I said earlier this morning, and I know I said this to Greg, that history is not a happy greeting card from the past with nothing but good news. And he did good history. I know the historians here were proud of him. There were probably people who didn't like what he said, but that wouldn't be unusual in any field.
Jeff Weiss, retired physician. Some of you may have seen that the current issue of National Geographic talks about accelerated evolution of the human. And as I read it, seemed to be kind of a thinly veiled promotion of some of the concepts of eugenics. My question for you is, is there still evidence in your mind that there are academic supporters of eugenics that exist in the current time frame?
Well, the hard part about that question is it focuses me to ask another question, which is, what do you mean by eugenics? Because it's such a broad field. And one of the things I've tried to do is to point out that it's a mistake for us to vilify people and say, oh, they were involved with eugenics, because it's almost everyone. And that's why I put up the slide with the list of people. You can find people on that slide, there are like 30 of them, who had sometimes said something good about eugenics. You can find people from every field of life. You can find presidents, you can find Nobel Prize winners, you can find lots of physicians and lawyers and scientists, each one of whom is revered in their field, one way or the other. So I think when you ask me, is there something that's going on in the academy having to do with eugenics, the answer is almost certainly yes. What I'm interested in, and what I hope I focused on today, is the use of science as a panacea for social problems, and the promise that we can figure it out scientifically. Just leave us alone. We'll take care of this part. And we will make those scientific insights into public policy. If I've said anything more than once in my career, and I've said most things 100 times, that is a mistake. It is a mistake to think that we can use science to fix our social problems in the absence of a reexamination and reflection on the kind of attitudes that I was talking about this morning. I've had academic food fights with people at different institutions about what eugenics means, or whether or not they represented something that I thought looked an awful lot like the old eugenics. If you're really interested in this stuff and you're having a problem with insomnia, I've got like a 100-page article out there about the Pioneer Fund that goes through this stuff in great and dreary detail. But I don't think that's necessary. I think that, again, you don't have to be a scientist, or you certainly don't have to be an academic to understand that what drives the most repressive parts of this agenda and was part of our law is a set of attitudes which doesn't go away.
My name is John Davis. I used to work here. I thought that was a great review, bringing out how widespread eugenics, how it was supported throughout this country in the great institutions. Harvard was a real leader. Mm-hmm. Many of the churches were very strongly behind it because they took care of the disabled and the poor. I want to bring up something that you haven't mentioned, which is abortion. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think about abortion on choices such as sex or color of eyes or some other mild defect or anything that is part of our life today and fully accepted by the majority of our people. I think there's some real moral questions there, and I'd like to know what your thoughts might be.
The very first course that I took that had anything to do with biomedical ethics was actually in this building, and Jim Childress was running it. And he had just spent some time in Washington. And as I recall, he said to us, we used to have lunch every day up at the Kennedy Center. And the Kennedy Center luncheons were wonderful because we had all these great scholars. But there was one topic we never talked about, and that was abortion. I think I remember you saying that, Jim. And the point was, it was an inflammatory topic that was hard to get through without people getting very upset. Obviously, it still is today. I have concentrated a fair amount of effort in the last 2 years at going back in granular detail and reading in the popular press as well as professional journals what people thought about eugenics, what people thought about birth control, and what they thought about abortion, say in 1916. And the answer that I have is, most of them thought they could find something good to say about eugenics. It would be hard to know what it was unless you asked them further questions. Many people in the eugenics movement were split on the question of birth control. Some said it was a bad idea. Teddy Roosevelt went ballistic every time you mentioned it. He said, oh, that's race suicide. All those girls going to Harvard should be out there having babies. We can't have that. And a long, long literature on that. But then there were people on the other side, also part of the movement, who said, we think this is a good idea. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. We should be selective. On the question of abortion, there is almost universal silence, because in 1916, either because people didn't talk about such things, although they did talk about them in the newspapers when someone died, there was no debate about eugenics and abortion. So when people ask me questions about eugenics and abortion, I say, as a historian, there was nobody in the eugenics movement who ever came out publicly in favor of abortion. So it's fine for us to have the debates today, and obviously they will go on regardless of what I say, but the abortion debate and eugenics are topics which don't fit the historical frame that I look at all. And I would rather that we argue about abortion and use other words, because the other words are not so freighted with pictures of Hitler and swastikas.
Hi, I'm Preston Reynolds. It's a real honor to meet you and listen to this talk. I'm a physician. I'm also very professionally trained as a historian. And I teach a course on grounds on race, health disparities, and the history of African Americans in the health professions. And was invited to serve on the President's Commission on Slavery in the university, and was invited, part of a newly created course on slavery and its legacy at UVA, to teach a lecture on eugenics and its impact here on grounds. And I approached that lecture as a historian, coming from my other course, thinking, well, I knew about race science, and then read Gregory Dorr's book and your material and was really impacted by what I learned. That lecture reverberated a lot. I ended up meeting with President Sullivan, gave her a copy of Gregory Dorr's book, talked with Dr. Rick Shannon, and a lot of that scholarship that you pioneered and published really was instrumental in the renaming of Jordan Hall in honor of Vivian Penn. So I really want to thank you and let you know that the work that you did, while it was controversial, actually I think is contributing to a much larger conversation. I've been invited to give that same lecture now 5 times to undergraduate courses and to the medical students. And people are saying, why aren't we talking about this more, and the impact it continues to have in the conversations or the lack of conversations here on ground. So I hope your lecture today is part of that ongoing need to open up this topic for further exploration and to make sure that we right the wrongs of what's happened in the past. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. Obviously, I'm flattered. I should say, though, that there was a course that was given, usually it was held in one of the pavilions or sometimes the rotunda in the 90s and early 2000s on the history of the university. And every year that I can remember, for about 10 years, somebody in the history department asked me to come over and give a lecture on eugenics. So there was, there wasn't any, nobody was shying away from it. It was out there and people were talking about it. And I agree with you that this is the sort of thing that, if one thing has been constant in my life, it's been giving talks like this and then somebody coming up to me, usually someone who was as old or older than me, and then someone who was in high school, and both of them said the same thing. Why did nobody ever tell me about this? So it's obvious that it bears repeating. Thank you.
Hi, I completely echo all of the wonderful things, and it's an honor to be here in your lecture today. My name is Caitlin Dreisbach, and I'm a doctoral student in the School of Nursing, and I've done a lot of personal investigation for coursework in the School of Nursing on nursing's role in eugenics, particularly in the Buck v. Bell case. What is your narrative or argument as to why there aren't stories of nurses involved in eugenics? You know, we hear a lot about physician involvement and physician-driven medicine, and knowing the essential role that nurses play in that patient care. Where are the nursing stories?
You probably know better than I, because there are some missing characters in all these stories. Nurses are one group that's missing. And it's not because they weren't there, because we know they were there. We know they were there, you know, as nurses have always been in healthcare, standing side by side with whoever was doing the surgery, whoever was doing the diagnosis, et cetera. So it's always been a challenge to me to find the voice of nurses. I never did. You're in a better position to do that now, and I think probably know where the sources are, so good luck.
Wasn't there a play done about Nurse Rivers with the Tuskegee?
Yes. Yeah, Mrs. Evers' Boys.
Right.
Yeah.
And that nurse died just a few years ago, but I think lived to see the apology.
Right.
Yeah. Other comments and questions? So again, taking things, you know, as Joan often wanted to do, why does this matter to us today and tomorrow? You made some closing remarks that suggested that we be a little more tuned in to the talk, the rhetoric, and the underlying assumptions in our national and international scene today. Any thoughts you have about ways that we might best help the public conversation be a more reasonable one, and perhaps embrace some attitudes that are not these historic ones you've talked about?
Yeah, I think that I gave a talk like this not too long ago, and someone in the crowd asked me if I was trying to make a political point, and what I said to them was, yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to make a political point, but actually the material that I read at that talk was something I'd written 10 years ago. Most of what I said today, the pictures are new, but most of what I said today was stuff that is in articles that are a decade or more old. When I wrote my book on the Buck case, it came out in 2008, and there were 5 or 6 pending controversies, if not pieces of legislation, that had been proposed, one right here in Virginia, to sterilize people. So it's not like we miss examples. It's not like there aren't enough out there. It's not like we have to focus on any person as the embodiment of these problems. It does seem to me that there are some things that are relatively straightforward. We don't have to use the word eugenics when we talk about the level of contempt that we dredge up to blame people with because of their station in life. And if we've learned anything over the 250 years of this experiment, we probably should have learned that finding scapegoats and making them the brunt of our fears always has a bad end.
So anyone have a closing comment or question? Yes, Jody.
Does the topic of eugenics come up in conversations about capital punishment?
It does, yes. It does because the earliest arguments for eugenics relied on 2 things. One was segregation, which Greg Dorr has spelled out so well in his book, and the other was sterilization. Imprisonment was thought to be the ideal segregation. You lock people up, they can't have children. So that's an area that you can think about. When you execute people, they certainly can't have children. And in the case of so-called eugenic euthanasia, that's what the Nazis did. Whether or not that rule applies in 21st century America, whether we should use eugenics to talk about capital punishment, again, to me, I don't really care to argue about what the Nazis did and whether we should call it eugenics. I think that if you have an argument about capital punishment, you should make that on moral grounds. You don't even need the word.
So I'd like to thank Paul Lombardo for this enlightening lecture and some things to think about going forward, certainly. I'll also remind you this is the last Medical Center Hour of the spring semester of this academic year. We will resume in early September, and we hope that you'll be back with us. In the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you for your patronage and your participation through this year. It's been a wonderful year-long conversation, and we anticipate more of the same next year. So thank you all for being here, and again, please join me in thanking Paul Lombardo.
Thank you.